Okay, morning everybody. Welcome to this morning's AGP webinar. Thanks for attending. Obviously, busy times for everybody. I apologise if you've heard my blur about 50,000 times now. I'm getting starting to say it in my sleep a little bit at the moment. So I'm Lisa from the AGP team at Winning Pitch, here to help facilitate the session today alongside Flair Jones, who is our expert delivering this webinar. I'll pass you over to her very shortly, but just before, can I just ask you all to make sure that your microphones are muted at the moment, just during the presentation, so that it avoids any interference or background noise. There will be a question and answer session later in the webinar. Obviously, then you can switch your mics back on, or if you prefer, you can ask questions on the chat facility. And Flair will try to answer as many of these as possible. Just while we're on the chat function, can I ask you all just to type your name into there to make sure that, one, it's working, and also that I'm able to do a little bit of a register for who's attended this morning, and it helps me with the names on there. If you need any support during the webinar, I'll be monitoring the chat, so if you have any problems, please just ask. The webinar is being recorded, which just helps us to collate any questions or comments which may be missed during the live webinar. If anyone has any questions or concerns about this, please do let me know. Following on from the webinar, I'll be sending out 2 emails to you. We will require you to sign a digital registration form for the Welsh Government, our AG3, and you'll receive an email via HelloSign to do this with a link. It literally takes less than a minute and is really easy for you to follow. It also confirms to the Welsh Government that the webinar took place and how many people attended. So it's really important that you sign these and send them back to us. You'll also receive an email with a link to 2 surveys to provide feedback to us. Obviously, these are a work in progress with these webinars, so any feedback that we get, we really welcome, so we can help develop the programme and offer any other support during this crisis. So now I'll just hand you over to Flair to carry on with the presentation.
Thank you very much, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on the furlough scheme and the coronavirus job retention scheme. These are very complicated times for us all, obviously, and I thought maybe all of you will have read and will have known something about the CGRS, but just to remind ourselves, first of all, of what the basics are. It applies to all employers across the UK with a PAYE scheme, and that therefore means it doesn't discern between different types of employers, albeit there's some employers in the public sector will have limited ability to use this scheme, depending on what other sources of funding from a public fund that they already receive. Otherwise, if you're a private sector business or a charity or a one-man band or working in partnership, all of those of you who are employers in any of those capacities will be able to access this scheme, provided you pay your staff through the PAYE scheme. It applies to any employee who's on the payroll on the 28th of February. So the 28th of February date has been introduced by the government as an anti-fraud measure, so that people don't just willy-nilly put themselves or put others on this scheme just for the benefit of the scheme without them having been properly in your employ before the 28th of February. So that's where that comes from. And basically what it means, obviously, and I'm sure you all are very familiar with this already, is that if an employee is furloughed, which means they're doing 0 work for you and they cannot do any work for you for various reasons, then they will, HMRC will reimburse you as the employer for 80% of the gross wages from March 2020, 1st of March 2020 onwards. So it's a retrospective thing as well. So anyone that was in your employ after the 28th of February can be paid up to 80% of their gross wages from March 2020. The furlough leave can be taken in 3-week blocks, so that means you could rotate people, and that's been very popular with lots of the clients I've advised, because they just feel that, well, we've got lots of people doing a very similar job, but we basically want to share the pain out so that not one person or 3 people or whatever are furloughed for the entire potential 3 months that this scheme is currently going to run for. You could just flip-flop people, but you will need to keep people updated about their status. So if you are deciding to furlough someone and you get their consent to do so, but it's only going to be for 3 weeks, you will need to make sure that you're in touch with them and they understand that at the end of the 3 weeks they will need to be returning to work, and the baton gets possibly passed on to someone else. So that's quite a nice flexible part of the scheme that the government have introduced. The reimbursement I mentioned above, about 80% of gross wages, is actually subject to a monthly cap of 2,500 plus employers' national insurance and auto-enrolment pension contributions. So if you earn more than £2,500 a month gross, then the cap will be 2,500. So obviously it's not like if you're a very high earner and you take home, say, £4,000 a month, you will be suffering a significant drop in salary because obviously the government can only pay so much, and they already estimate that the cost of doing this scheme for 3 months is going to cost the economy between 30 and 40 billion pounds. So that gives you an idea of how widely it's going to be used, and also the cost involved with it. Now, lots of people have been asking us about what this word furlough means. Well, it's an American word, an American term that's been used in America for many years. There are examples of it here as well, but it's obviously just come into the common terms that we use much more, regrettably, during the last sort of few months. It just literally means that those people you decide who cannot work for any reason for you can be put on this scheme. And obviously the scheme that the government is running is the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. So what do you need to do if you're trying to decide whether to furlough people? First of all, you need to look very carefully at who is doing what roles for you and which ones are not really required to work or who cannot work during this difficult time. So for example, I'm a solicitor, so most people in my law firm, we're able to work remotely quite well. So at the moment, we are not furloughing very many of our fee earners. Having said that, we have quite a lot of admin staff who support us normally in the office and who are very important to us. But unfortunately, their ability to support us on admin matters is either limited or not in existence at all. So regrettably, we've had to furlough those people. There are other people, obviously, who may have dependents at home or significant childcare requirements, or who are looking after a vulnerable person. Those people possibly cannot work because they've got other demands on their time due to schools being closed or someone being unwell. Those also can be furloughed. So there are very many reasons why you might decide that people just aren't able to work or are not required to work. So once you've decided that, that's the first step you need to consider once you've satisfied yourself that they were all your members of staff prior to the 28th of February and that they're paid through PAYE. You definitely need to agree the furlough with the employee. Now, we've had lots of questions and queries over the last few weeks. It feels like months, but it's been weeks, about what consultation needs to be put in place with employees before furlough can be implemented. At the beginning, we were advising, well, this is very exceptional times. We probably just need you to inform your employees that this is the case, because we couldn't see that lots of businesses could afford very lengthy consultation periods. It's become clear subsequently, because there was a bit of a lag between the announcement about this scheme and the guidance being introduced by the government, that an element of consultation is necessary, but we are still advising that consultation doesn't need to be very lengthy. It just needs to effectively make sure that you explain very clearly to your affected employees what is happening and why, and seek their consent quite quickly. So if, for example, you have employees who are reluctant or resistant to it, then you need to explain to them very clearly that the alternative quite probably is going to be their redundancies, and that normally gets people to play along with this scheme and to realise that actually earning 80% of their normal monthly wage at the moment is not a bad deal. We haven't really found lots of people who have been resistant to this, but we have found, I've been advising some employees where the employers have acted rather unscrupulously and have effectively either enforced furlough on them or in fact dismissed people even though the furlough scheme was available and even though they actually had the cash flow to keep going, despite the fact, you know, whilst waiting for HMRC to reimburse them. So the best thing to do is make sure you've got an element of consultation and then seek that consent as quickly as you can. And once you've got that consent and you've got it in writing or they've signed up to it, you can proceed to furlough. What that then means, obviously, is that you start paying them from the point of consent, the lower of 80% of their normal monthly wage or the £2,500 a month. Obviously, at the moment, the HMRC scheme isn't up and running because they are scrambling to try and get this up and running because due to manpower and so very many other things that HMRC are having to contend with at the moment. The recent talk was that this hopefully should be available by beginning of May, which is quite quick given I think the announcement was made on the 23rd of March, wasn't it? So hopefully from that point in time, there will be the ability to make that application for the reimbursement and to receive payment. Now, what we don't know is how quickly those applications will be processed, or indeed what exactly that process will entail, and also what measures or tests HMRC will put in place about how to decide whether an application is valid or not. I mean, the guidelines currently are very, very wide and quite kind to employers. So I'd like to think that there won't be very many employers who will struggle to achieve the benefits of this scheme. But having said that, the devil always is in the detail, and until they've actually announced the details of the application process, it's going to be hard to know exactly how that's going to work. Obviously, as an employer, what you need to make sure is that you've got enough cash flow to be able to keep paying your employees at the lower of 80% of employees' normal monthly wage or the £2,500 a month, whilst the HMRC scheme is being set up. And sadly, we've advised quite a lot of clients who are not in that fortunate position and are saying, look, you know, our funds or our source of money have dried up overnight. We're not going to be able to keep paying these people in the interim. And then obviously, sadly, we've had to sort of look at redundancies for those people. The last bullet point on that slide is very important, to keep up communications with furloughed employees. It's quite easy really to seek the consent and to consult with them before furlough happens. And then it's like, oh, phew, right, out of sight, out of mind. We're all sat in our kitchens or our dining rooms or our studies or whatever at home. We've all got 1,000,001 things that we are worrying about, you know, from sort of a day-to-day running of the business kind of aspect. But, you know, these people are sat at home with not very much to do, and keeping up the communications is key. And in fact, the guidance suggests that you need to make sure you do that every sort of 3 weeks. So not only is it sensible to use a sort of good letter to communicate the fact that you want to put them on furlough in the first instance, but I think you probably can all develop template letters that keep up those communications going forward as well. And that's certainly something that we as a firm are looking to roll out to our clients and contacts, so to make that process as easy as possible. It's also obviously very sensible to keep up communications by email, by phone, by Teams, by Zoom with these people, because there is a very large and significant aspect of mental health to think about here. I thank my lucky stars personally that I've got a lot of work to do during this time, because I think the thought of being idle and with lots of time to fill is quite frightening, and that's the position these furloughed employees will be in. So do keep in touch with them. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. In fact, it's actively encouraged. Just going on to a few FAQs on furlough, because we've found that that's quite a good way to tease out some of the issues that may be concerning you. So one question we've had a lot of the time is, can employees be furloughed for only part of their working week? Well, no, sadly, the answer is not. You cannot do that, because the general rule is that employees must not do any work at all whilst they've been furloughed, or you will not be able to claim that reimbursement. I've come across some horror stories where people have been furloughed and then they've been turning up in the workplace and been saying that they're volunteering for their employers. I don't think actually that's in the spirit of the scheme, quite frankly, and people should be very careful before allowing employees to do that. Fair enough for them to go and volunteer elsewhere, obviously, or even to get work elsewhere, but you cannot, I think, justify getting people to volunteer in the workplace instead of paying them. So that's a good point to make. But I think it's one of the frustrations of the scheme, actually, the fact that it's fantastic that the government have stepped up like they have and to pay 80% of people's salaries, but in a way, there are very many employers out there who could possibly keep their workers working for part of the working week. And it's a shame then that there's no capacity for government to step in to pay the difference between part-time working and full-time working. But that's how the scheme works, and for the time being anyway, you cannot do that. And I suppose trying to monitor whether people are actually keeping to just working part of the working week and a government top-up would be even harder to monitor. So how do you calculate 80% of monthly wages for employees whose pay varies from month to month, for example, casual workers? Now, this obviously is a big concern for very many people who have got lots of workers on their books who are not paid just a normal annual salary. People who are on 0-hour contracts, for example, or who are just working casually for you. So the guidance is that employers should use the higher of the employee's monthly wage from the same month last year, or their 12 monthly average earnings. So if someone has been with you more than 12 months, then you can look at that average pay for them and then compare to what the pay was last month and go for the higher of those sums. If people haven't got 12 months service with you, you can look at the average monthly earnings for the period they've been with you and do the same thing and basically go on the basis of what the highest sum would be since they've started with you and work out the average from that. So does holiday continue to accrue during furlough leave? Yes, it does, just as it does for employees on maternity leave or long-term sickness absence. However, there doesn't seem to be any reason why employers can't require furloughed employees to take holiday during their furlough leave. Now, that's something that we've advised on quite a lot, because lots of people have been going, well, who wants to take holidays during this weird period where we're all sat either in our homes or gardens, or a combination of both if you're lucky enough to have a garden. The problem with not making people take some holidays during furlough leave is that effectively when we come out of this, you will have possibly an entire workforce champing at the bit for a bit of holiday, and then you'll have a flurry of requests at a time when you're basically trying to get your business back on track and to increase orders or to increase productivity or what have you. So Regulation 15 of the Working Time Regulations 1998 allow employers to require employees to take holiday, provided they give them twice as much notice of that holiday as the period of the holiday is going to be. So for example, if someone's furloughed for 3 weeks and you want the third week to be a holiday or taken as holiday, then you would need to give them 2 weeks notice. So at the beginning of the furlough leave, you'd need to tell your employees that the third week that they're off is going to be treated as a week of annual leave. If it's just 1 day that they're taking, then you could just give them 2 days notice. So that's the principle. If you do that, then you may be able to manage better how people will use their holidays when we're all back in the office or when the economy starts to pick up. And I think that's quite important. So for example, you might think, well, we're not going to enforce on people to take their entire, if they've already booked 2 weeks off in May, say, and this is still going on then. You might say that's a bit tough to make them take what was meant to be a trip of a lifetime to Canada or something. But what we might do is say, well, okay, we'll agree that you don't have to take the 2 weeks, but could you take a couple of days? Just so that people eat away a little bit at their holiday entitlement during this period. In terms of pay, you need to be careful about that as well if people are taking holiday, because for the statutory holiday entitlement, you need to pay people their normal remuneration, okay? So for the first 4 weeks, that actually, so the first 20 days, that includes commission and bonus pay as well to be calculated in it, provided those are contractual. For the next 1.6 weeks up to the 28-day statutory entitlement, you just need to pay people normal remuneration. After that, obviously, and it's just a contractual leave, you could ask them to go down to 80%. So my point being is that if you're making people take holiday during furlough, you will need to top up their salary a little bit to reflect either their normal remuneration, or if you've already also agreed a slight pay reduction or before furlough came in, then up to that level of their pay as agreed with them. So yeah, holiday is something that I think needs to be carefully managed and thought through so that you don't have that big backlog. And another thing you might want to do is tell people who have got more than 28 days statutory entitlement to holiday that they might not be able to carry over into a next annual leave year much more than that 28-day, so that you don't have next year being absolutely inundated with people with very, very much leave to take. So can employees be furloughed without their consent? We've already touched on this. Absolutely no, unless there's a temporary layoff clause in their contract for which you basically have to pay people 100% of their salary. Now, most people won't have these temporary layoff clauses in the contracts because they're kind of a thing of the past. When I started doing employment law, which is back in the early noughties, then there were lots of layoff clauses in contracts at that time because we had not long before come out of quite a significant recession. But since then, and I appreciate we've been through a recession since then too, but lots of employers have moved away from these layoff clauses, particularly as there's been a move away from lots of manufacturing in this country. So you should check your contract just in case you've got layoff clauses in there, but I wouldn't be surprised if you don't. If you do, good for you, you could lay those people off in keeping with that clause, but otherwise you will need to make sure that you consult appropriately and get that expressed signed consent. And if you've got collective bargaining provisions in place with your workforce, we recommend that you do engage with them under those rules, because that will also avoid a lot of problems in terms of people claiming that you haven't gone about consultation properly. So what happens if a furloughed employee develops COVID-19? This is obviously something that is unfortunately likely to happen to very many of us. And there is an absolute requirement on staff to tell you if they've got symptoms of COVID-19, or if they're told that they've got to self-isolate because someone else in the household has got it. This is because they need to be put on SSP instead of furlough pay, and HMRC have been very clear about that. And the SSP will then be paid for the 14 days that an employee has been in isolation. So make sure that you require that from your employees. And also, I think it's quite important so that each business in a way is tracking the disease and its spread amongst population. You know, it would be nice to think that possibly government asks employers to share that data that they've got so that they can try and assess how this is spreading through the population as well. So it's a good thing to do. So how do you deal with disputes about which staff should be furloughed? This is a strange byproduct of these rules in the sense that, as I said earlier, if you've got a group of people who are all doing the same job, how do you select which ones should be furloughed and which ones should be kept working? The only way to do so is to make sure you use an objective selection process, a bit like you would if you're making people redundant. Obviously, the criteria would be slightly different. And we've been advising that if you've got older or vulnerable workers or people who are living or looking after older or vulnerable people, it's okay to prioritise those for furlough over everyone else. It's a weird one because some staff members may feel hard done by because they haven't been furloughed. Personally, I'd be the other way around, but you can see that some people are thinking, oh, why am I having to keep working while that person gets to sit at home and watch Netflix all day? Well, absolutely, that is, you know, an issue. But vice versa as well. Some people are thinking, why have I been furloughed when I'm absolutely champing at the bit to work and my colleagues over there are still being allowed to work and fill their days with work? I'm afraid all you can do really is communicate with people and make sure that you reassure them and possibly think of ways to incentivize them. You might say, look, when this is over, we'll allow you to carry over more of your holiday than we will those who've been furloughed. We won't impose holiday on you while this is going on. Or you might say, look, we'll pay you a little bit more just to keep the home fire burning. And obviously the other benefit here is that you can flip-flop people by putting them on furlough for minimum periods of 3 weeks. So that does actually spread the pain. So if you've got lots of people doing the same type of work, you could actually just rotate them into and out of furlough. So what's the likelihood of a challenge from HMRC if an element of government funding is received? This will depend on what proportion of an organisation's funding comes from public funds and whether this money goes directly to staff costs or not. The guidance from HMRC is quite clear on public sector employers or employers who receive public funding, that if that funding is continuing, then furlough isn't really for you, particularly if it goes directly to staff costs. Because that is logically sensible, isn't it? Effectively, you are receiving funds from government anyway to make these jobs happen. So therefore, if that funding continues and is in place and those people are able to work productively for you, then furlough is not going to work. If, for example, you've got public funding for a function that cannot work whilst this is going on, and you decide and agree with your funder that those funds could be diverted either internally in your organisation or that you need to repay them or whatever, then obviously furloughing those members of staff is perfectly acceptable. So you need to look very carefully at your funding arrangements with your funder, whoever that might be, and then work out whether that funding is going to continue, whether your staff members are working productively for you during this period of time. If so, then this scheme is not for you, but there are very many different variations on that, as I've just touched on, that you might want to consider to see whether furlough actually could work for you. In terms of timescales, how quickly can we implement this? Well, as I said earlier, you can absolutely start to consult with staff on furloughing straight away. So, for example, as soon as the scheme came in, I think it was the 23rd of March, it was literally an announcement, and within a few days people were starting to consult, even though at that time we didn't really have a copy of the proper guidance from the UK government on it. So there's no need to wait for HMRC to set themselves up and to start reimbursing. You can start it immediately, provided you've got the employees' agreement to that. If furlough is beyond 1 month, does redundancy entitlement kick in? No, there is no current maximum period for furlough and no automatic trigger point for redundancy. So, for example, at the moment, the talk is that the scheme is going to be in place for 3 months at a cost of around 30 to 40 billion pounds for the economy. Now, who knows where we will be in 3 months' time and whether actually we're in a position the government stops the scheme at that point. I fear that when the scheme comes to an end, and unless the economy picks up quickly, then we are going to be looking at quite a lot of redundancies at that point. But there is no set period that obviously will mean the redundancies start to happen. It literally is about how long does the scheme last for, and what the company, your company's cash flow position and likelihood of being able to keep doing what you were doing pre-COVID-19 will be able to do subsequent to this period. So what form does consultation with members of staff need to take? So you can start the process by sending them a letter setting out your processes and asking them to confirm their agreement. As I said earlier, if you don't get the consent straight away, then you can follow this up with a longer consultation processes, which obviously has to be done virtually, but there's all manner of ways we can communicate, aren't there? This being one, Zoom being one, Teams, FaceTime, WhatsApp, this, calls, normal old-fashioned calls, all manner of things. So make sure you contact with them. And we've been saying, look, you're probably looking at sort of 7 to 14 days consultation if you don't get that consent straight away. And obviously people need to understand what the alternative is, which is very likely going to be redundancy. What notice would we need to end the furlough process with an individual member of staff? Now, there's no minimum period, and again, do remember that the need to consult and to communicate with your members of staff throughout furlough is very important. So what we've been advising is you just need to act responsibly. So, for example, if someone's furloughed because of their childcare arrangements and they've got 3 small children at home that they are completely and utterly unable to work for you because of that, and that's why they've been furloughed, then it's going to be completely unreasonable to say to those people, well, you need to return to work tomorrow, because they will need to make arrangements for alternative childcare. So be reasonable, think about it. You should all be thinking strategically about your business needs anyway, and trying to work out roughly when things may change or happen, which means that you would like to bring people out of furlough. So just make sure that you work that into your sort of strategic plan for the next few months. So can furloughed employees get involved in community volunteering as long as they're not related to their paid occupation, but using company vehicles, for example? Absolutely, they can, as long as they don't provide services to or generate revenue for your organisation. We've had a recent example where an organisation were going to be supplying their techie people to help set up a field hospital. And that was absolutely fine. That would have been, they were all furloughed, and then they were going to be, the staff members were going to be volunteering, which is fine. And then they were going to also supply the company vehicles for the purposes of doing that. The question then arose whether the organisation in question could charge for the time and the use of the vehicles to the NHS or to the Welsh Government. And the answer, of course, was no, you can't, because otherwise they would be, even though they are volunteering themselves, they would still be seen to be generating revenue for the organisation in question. So that's a good example of why volunteering needs to be just that. Absolutely, if you feel that you can share and use company vehicles for these purposes, you must do so. But do obviously check that your vehicle insurance policy will allow for that too, or whether you need to tweak that to cover it. So what documentation or evidence should we have in place when managing furloughed working? As I said to you, communication is king, and the more you do that and the more you do that in writing, the better. Make sure you keep copies of all letters and emails or WhatsApps, etc., that you send to people during the consultation process. And also just make sure that the instruction not to work during furlough is kept very clearly, and you've got all of that. So now's the time to ramp up the content of each person's personnel file. And we do this so we've got our own paper trail, but we're also doing it so that in case HMRC make inquiries about whether the process is legit or not, or whether you've done something that you shouldn't have done, then the easiest way to dispel any such concerns is to show them or any other inspector your paper trail. As I said before, try and make sure you do this every 3 weeks and let them know when their furlough will be renewed and what justification there is, because there is likely to be some disputes later. Lots of employees are understandably discombobulated and slightly upset that this is happening. So if they start to think that you're just abandoning them, then trouble will arise, no doubt. And that's it from me in terms of the questions and the sort of overview I wanted to give you. I'm hoping that that's been helpful to you. If you've got any questions, I'm very happy to take them now.
Okay, if anyone wants to come off the mute and ask any questions, or if you're happier to put them in the side chat, we can have a look there.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Oh, just a question about the 3-week rule, and if somebody comes off furlough and they have to go into self-isolation, how does that affect the length of the furlough?
So furlough, if you have to go into self-isolation, you're effectively coming off furlough anyway and being paid SSP. So you're only furloughed if you're fit and healthy but unable to work, basically. As soon as you either have to self-isolate because a member of your member of your family has become ill, or you become ill yourself, then you need to inform your employer, and you basically then are treated as you're on sickness absence and paid SSP, and the government will pay that SSP for 14 days.
So say you're on furlough for a week,
Yeah.
And then you go into self-isolation.
Yeah.
Go back into furlough. You've broken your 3-week furlough. Then the week before the self-isolation, would you still get a grant for that, or because it was only a week, would you have to pay yourself for that week?
That's a very good question. I think you would. I think I haven't seen any express guidance on this, but I would guess. I would imagine that the fact that the intention was the person was going to be furloughed for 3 weeks, but they were disrupted for reasons outside of their control, i.e. either ill themselves or a member of their household was ill, then I think the first week would be seen in conjunction with the 2 weeks that would follow the 14-day period of isolation. I would have thought that they will deal with that quite practically and like that.
Okay. The other query I had was about the bank holidays that we're just about to have. I've got some people who went into furlough straight away on the 24th.
Yeah.
And I'd like them to come back on Tuesday, which will be 3 weeks.
Yeah.
But I'm concerned about how the 2 bank holidays that we're just about to have are going to be dealt with. Can they be included in the furlough? Or do we have to stretch the furlough for another 2 days to make up for that?
No, I don't think so. I think the intention is the bank holidays are treated as days upon which you are effectively furloughed, because the country stopped working, obviously, because it's a bank holiday, but that's just how the timing of this happens. So I would suggest that is included within your 3-week furlough period, and you don't need to put those to one side and treat them any differently. Effectively add 2 more days to the furlough period because there were 2 days of bank holidays, because it's not like the government are not going to pay workers or employees for those 2 bank holidays, because they'll be just treated as normal working days, won't they, for the purposes of how they calculate this. So I think that's fine. The other question for you, obviously, is whether you might want to treat those days as part of your employees' holiday entitlement and top up their pay and tell them that those 2 days are treated as holidays by you. Because that's something that would be open for you to do as well. And then at least they've taken 2 days of their annual leave entitlement during this period at very little extra cost to you over the 80% the government is prepared to pay.
So if I topped up those 2 bank holidays with the extra 20%, would they then say, well, they're not furloughed days, they're holidays, so actually you didn't have your employee furloughed for 3 weeks?
No, I mean, the holiday point is a little bit of a grey area, and we're waiting for further guidance from government on this. But because of the provisions of the working time regulations and the fact that an employer can ask employees to take holidays anytime, so obviously when there's no furlough or anything, I can't see why that principle wouldn't apply here. So effectively, that means that even though they're on furlough, you're saying, well, we're going to treat a couple of days as a holiday for you. But that the government wouldn't then turn around and say that those days were not then furlough days because you've treated them as holiday. Because remember, it's open to you to top up people's salaries to 100% at any point during the furlough period. You don't have to put people on 80% just because they've been furloughed. You could keep paying that 20%. So in a way, doing that for the days they're on holiday is no different.
Okay. Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great.
Cool.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
No worries.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions coming up on the chat. I'm not sure if you can see it from your screen.
Sure I can if I start looking. Hold on.
Just down the bottom, we've got an R carver.
If I stop share.
Yeah, it should come up. And then you've got chat down the bottom.
Chat, where are we? Oh, yes, sorry.
Yeah, does that bring up the chat?
Yes, it does. Yeah, it does.
So I think our questions start from the question, if once this situation is over and the company needs to make redundancies, are you able to make furloughed employees redundant?
If once the company needs to make redundant. Yes, indeed you are. I mean, obviously, you will need to consult with them in the way that you would with any employee, but there's no reason not to. So, for example, if you know that the furlough scheme or the CGRS is coming to an end on a certain date, and you know that post that point, your business will not have picked up enough for you to have the appropriate cash flow, or the need for someone's role to be done has gone down, then you would be able to start a consultation process with those furloughed employees whilst they're on furlough, because that would be treated as an ancillary matter rather than them effectively working whilst you consult with them. And that's the same, I should add as well. So say someone is in the middle of a disciplinary process, or someone wants to raise a grievance, those things can still be dealt with whilst people are furloughed, because they're treated as ancillary matters rather than things that are sort of direct core work that people are doing. So you would be certainly able to consult with people and make them redundant whilst on furlough. So hopefully that answered that question. So I go on to the next one.
Yeah.
So can a company director be furloughed for a period of time? Also for clarity, if family members become ill, would carer need to go down the SSP route to look after them? Yes, so company directors can indeed be furloughed. Just like everyone else, obviously you need the consent of the board for that to happen. But provided they are an employee and paid through PAYE, they are not treated any differently to normal employees who are not company directors. The same goes for salaried partners in LLP practices and so forth as well. So you can absolutely decide, as long as it's subject to that minimum 3-week period, then you would be able to furlough them. Yes, as far as if you are not the person who's ill, but a family member becomes ill, you need to go into self-isolation, and you've got the responsibility to tell your employer that that's the case, and you would then be put on SSP even though you're not the one that's been ill. If a company is applying for an SME business grant, can staff still be furloughed? Yes, they can. There's nothing I've read that means that these things are exclusive. The test you need to concern yourself with if you decide whether to furlough staff is whether you've got any work for them to do. And if you haven't got work for them to do, then then they cannot work for you for reasons of looking after the people, etc., then you'd still be able to furlough them and take advantage of the CGRS scheme. Oh, another one. So our letter to employees did not state that they should not work, or I did not ask them to sign and return. Could I do this now? They have been furloughed since the 24th. That's a very good question. And to be fair to you, that's part of the general confusion in which everyone was advising at the time, I think. There was, a sense of massive panic in the country when we all just had to be told to go and work from home and to, business started to dry up. So a lot of people took the view that this was possibly something that could be imposed on people. Subsequent to that, it's become very clear that employees do need to give their consent. So I think, practically speaking, it would be sensible to try and seek their retrospective consent, but you probably want to have some thought as to how exactly you word that, because you want to avoid any sort of, how shall I say it, wise after the event employees basically thinking, haha, you didn't do this right, and therefore I've got something on you kind of thing. So I think this probably needs to be more of a general update to people and saying something, along the lines that could they just confirm they're in agreement with its continuing or something like that? Because I don't think there's any point in saying, oh, we forgot to ask you that at the time. Now can you give it to us retrospectively? I'd probably sort of fudge it a little bit, but yes, do get in touch with them and get something from them that means that they are signalling they're happy to continue under the scheme. And also the best way to get people to pipe down on all of that is to remind them what the alternative is. Any other questions?
I think it looks like everybody's okay.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you ever so much, everyone, for listening. I really hope it was helpful to you. We've got some template letters for both the process of beginning the furlough with people and getting that initial consent. We've also in the process of developing letters that can be used for the keeping in touch at the 3-week mark. So if you want to get some assistance on that basis, do come back to me. I've also got a bank of frequently asked questions that we've been answering for dealing with very many aspects of this. So if you do have any questions, do get in touch and we'll try our best to help you.
Thanks very much for presenting that, Fleur. There's lots of useful information, I'm sure, for everybody to take away in these times now. So thanks everyone for attending. And if you do have any requests How can I get in touch with you? Do you want them to get through to me first, or?
It's entirely up to you. They can absolutely go through you, or they can find me on our website at Darwin Gray, or feel free to link in with me as well. I'm on LinkedIn, whichever medium suits you all best. We've all got our favoured ones, haven't we?
That's lovely. Thanks very much again for doing that for us this morning.
No worries. Thank you very much.
Everybody. Cheers.
Bye.